Perfect. So we've got some yeses and hellos coming through. So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to motivate your students. My name is Billie, and I work as a teacher trainer and content creator in Cambridge in the UK. So I've been teaching for around 8 years in various countries around the world, some of the ones that you're mentioning, such as Italy, for example, mainly focusing on exam preparation courses for the Cambridge exam and for IELTS. So yeah, if you'd just like to write the country that you're from in the chat box, and if you're a teacher, and what sort of age group you teach as well. So we've got people from Serbia, Mexico, Poland, Spain, Russia as well, people teaching adults, some secondary schools, children as well, so lots of different variation. Perfect. So just before we begin, we've got a few housekeeping things just before we get started. So the webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a link to this so you can watch it back afterwards. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance emailed to you within the next 2 days. And also, if you have any questions, we'll have some time at the end for questions. But if you do have any as we go along, please do feel free to write them in the chat box at the bottom as well. So in previous sessions, the theory behind the exams has been introduced, as well as common problems that students have with particular exams. We've also looked at how to monitor progress and also how to provide feedback. So all of these past webinars can be accessed online if you have missed any. And today, step 5, we'll be talking about motivating students. So as well as that, we'll also be talking about mixed ability classes, how to motivate ourselves, which in turn then motivates our students, and also how we can try and keep those levels of motivation up throughout any duration of a course as well. So the main 6 points I'll be discussing today are providing differentiation between task types, so how to make practicing different task types more interactive, more collaborative. Peer teaching strategies, so sharing information and students learning from each other. Adapting task types for a student-centered environment, offering extension activities for fast finishers and also maybe multi-level classes as well. Encouraging learner autonomy and identifying key stages in the lead up to the exam as well. So just for reference, today I'll be mainly referring to the B2 first exam, which was known as the FCE, and also the C1 advanced exam as well, which also was known as the CAE. So I've used these as they're quite similar. So we've got the 4 papers. Most of the duration is quite similar as well. So you can see here in blue, we've got the B2, 1 hour, 15 minutes for the reading and use of English. And a little bit longer for the advanced exam, so just 15 minutes because we do have the extra part there as well. In the writing, we've just got 10 extra minutes for the advanced exam. And for the listening, the parts, the questions and the timings are the same. And then for the speaking, more or less the same as well. And the format of the speaking exam is quite similar too. So during the webinar, I'll be referring to these different task types within both exams and how to add some dynamism in teaching them rather than just a simple teach, test, teach format. So a question for you. So why do you think sometimes students lack motivation? So I think sometimes whether we teach exam classes or normal classes, student motivation is one of the biggest obstacles to overcome. So if you can just write in the chat box some reasons why you think students might become demotivated. So I'll just give you a minute. Yeah, boring materials. Yeah, so we'll look at different ways to sort of mix those up and practice them in a different way. Overworked, too much confidence. They feel they're not making progress. Routine learning. Yeah, I think repetitiveness is definitely one of the reasons. Being bored and confidence as well, definitely. So some ideas that I came up with, whether that is the behaviour, here we've got the behaviour of others, so whether that's the behaviour of a particular student around them, the placement of the students, so maybe they think they're in the incorrect class, for example, or in a lower level class than they previously studied in. The extrinsic motivation behind their learning, and simply because sometimes they don't understand what's going on in a particular lesson, and as many of you said as well, repetitiveness and the boredom just of repeating the same materials as well, or maybe the way that they're delivered. So we've got two types of motivation. So we have the extrinsic motivation and also the intrinsic motivation. So extrinsically motivated students learn in order to achieve something or to receive a reward of such. So this could be something like passing a test, getting a higher salary at work or a promotion, or pressure from parents. Extrinsically motivated students, on the other hand, are learning because they want to or have a passion for languages. So any class might have a mixture of these types of learners, but that doesn't mean that the intrinsically motivated students shouldn't also get a reward for their efforts. Feedback, time, praise, and just one-to-one time should all be given to students equally. However, as we know, sometimes giving time is easier said than done. So something like this will be discussed a little bit later on. So the first point I want to discuss is providing differentiation between task types. So just before we continue, Yulia said that she can't hear me. So could you just write yes one more time if you can hear me? Perfect. Okay, so no problems. So yeah, providing differentiation between task types. So as we know, our job as exam course teachers is to get students to succeed in their exams. So it can be very easy to follow the usual format of teach, test, teach, where learners first complete a task or activity without help from the teacher. Then based on the problems seen, once they've completed it, the teacher plans and presents the target language. Then the learners do another practice to see if they've actually picked up the new language, and then we assess it. But we may find ourselves repeating task types until we assume that students understand the structure or what to do or the timings. But just because we're working towards an end result doesn't mean that we can't use revision games and dynamic activities. We can work through exam tasks in an enjoyable way by encouraging pair or group work, for example, or even adding a competitive element to task types. So here's an example. So one thing I've previously done while preparing students for both the first and the advanced exams is to cut up a use of English paper. So here I've used part 4, the sentence transformations. So this is in both the first and the advanced. I often choose this because this is one that students struggle with, and also the open close, so the part 2 of the use of English paper as well. I normally put the students into small groups, making sure to mix up the shyer students with the more confident ones so they can learn from each other. I usually set a time of 10 to 12 minutes just to replicate the exam timings, and the group work through the task together. But it's more of a competitive thing. So the group that finishes first with the most correct answers would win points. So depending on the size of the class, the answers can be checked once the students have finished, and points can be awarded, or quite often, particularly with the sentence transformation, I cut it up into strips, stand in the middle of the class and check the answers as they hold each sentence up, using my face and my hands to let them know if there's something that needs to be changed or if it's correct or not. So this activity encourages peer learning, but it also adds a lighter and more fun and competitive element into the class as well. So it can also be difficult to practice speaking exercises in a classroom setting, particularly with larger classes. So there's only one of you and sometimes a lot more students than you can do practice tests with, or we just don't have the time. So another activity which works really well, and again adds more interactivity into the class, is when you show a real life speaking test, which can easily be found online by typing in Cambridge First, Advanced, or PET, as Olga's mentioned as well, the PET exam. So yeah, you can type that online, and often lots of videos come up with examinations, and there's often links to the notes and the marking criteria below the video as well. So you can divide the class into groups, give them something from the marking criteria to focus on in particular, which we can see here. And again, I've used the B2 as an example. So, for example, one group focuses on the grammar and vocabulary. The next group would focus on the discourse management. The next one on pronunciation, and the fourth group on interactive communication. So the students then watch the video and grade the speakers and write down their justification for the grade that they've given. So for example, if they think simple grammatical forms are used, so in this group here, they may score them a 1, a 2. If discourse management group thinks the student had very little hesitation, clear organisation and structure of ideas, they may score the student in the video a 4 or 5. But of course, you may need to go through the exact things that are required of each criteria. But students generally enjoy critiquing the video, and often they're harsher critics than the examiners themselves as well. So just before we look at the next activity, what are some of the ways that we can get students to speak more in class? So if you could write some of your ideas in the chat box, I'll give you a minute. Debates, yeah, role plays, information gaps from Evelyn, tongue twisters, Brian, that's always a good one, particularly for pronunciation. And yeah, so lots of debates, role plays, group discussions coming through. Acting, yeah, and topics that they care about, Simon, that's really important as well. And we'll be talking about sort of adjusting the topics to the students' preferences as well a little bit later on. So an activity we can do to practice speaking and listening is to put students into small groups and give them a practice speaking test, which can be one section or the whole test if time allows you or you think it'll be beneficial. So get each group to find a quiet space and to simulate a speaking test, but with recording themselves. So once each student has had the chance to speak on video, get them to watch their video back and to write 3 things that they thought they did well, again according to the examiner's marking criteria that we've just looked at, and 3 things that they might need to improve as well. So this is really useful because it also encourages students to think a bit more for themselves, to be a bit more autonomous in their learning, and also if they are struggling with it, it's okay for you to watch the video back and just provide some suggestions on them as well. So we've also got some more opportunities for speaking down here. So lead-in discussion questions at the beginning of the class. Again, that provides opportunities for pair work. Personal responses to a text, and again, that gives structure to the lesson as well. Speed discussions, which are quite useful for practicing part 1 and part 3 of the speaking test. So you can do it in a circle with one wider group on the outside, another group on the inside facing each other. Give them topics, again, maybe from part 1 or part 3, and get them to move around every 30-40 seconds to speak to a different student. And you can do some delayed error correction after the task as well. Justifying answers, which is really important, so they know how they got to the particular answer. And also peer feedback as well encourages speaking too. Just little things as well as the role plays and debates that you mentioned as well. So another activity which students always seem to enjoy is a circuit style activity, which can be useful halfway through the course when students are familiar with the format of each paper and the task type in the exam, as it practices certain task types that they struggle with, or the students can suggest ones that they'd like to practice. So you set up 4 stations in the room, or with extra space for the listening if you have it. So we've got listening, writing, use of English, and reading. We don't have the speaking in this one because, of course, there's only one of you and lots of your students. So you divide the class into 4 groups. Each group starts at a different station. So if the listening group do one task from the listening paper, they then move on to the writing, where they would have an essay topic, and they need to write the introduction, just the introduction, by paraphrasing the topic. Then the use of English. Again, it's up to you which task type you choose. And then the reading as well. For example, the multiple matching in C1 is quite a good example of this. So then they take their piece of paper with them and they move around to each station to avoid you photocopying so much. And they work individually on this task, but it really gives them a chance to really work themselves and try each task that they often struggle with as well. Often students do enjoy this task for the fact that they're just moving around and practicing the task types in a different way as well. And at the end, you can ask students to peer mark or correct as a class. And again, that can lead on to helping you know what to plan for the next lesson if they particularly struggled with one task type. Just a note on what Agnes said. You need a big classroom. The class that I work with at the moment, it is actually quite small, but I had the 3 stations in one classroom and I put the listening in a different classroom. And they seem to be quite responsible when it comes to exams. So of course, depends on the age group, but if you do have extra space for the listening, that's really helpful as well. So for making reading a bit more enjoyable, so here we've got another activity. So we can cut up a reading text and give each paragraph to small groups, including extra paragraphs that might be missing, for example, in reading part 7 of the advanced. So this way they can predict what the whole text would be about, predict some vocabulary they might find in it, and what might come before or after each paragraph, which is the aim of the task itself. This can then become a mingle where the aim is for the whole class or larger groups if you prefer to reconstruct the text, including the missing paragraphs. And this can then be checked as a whole class, and the class can explain which paragraph they left out and why. So some other ways to practice reading is here we've got a timed scanning task. So scanning skills are really important for the exam because the time is quite limited. So you give them the whole text, you give them 30-40 seconds to find specific information, such as countries mentioned or names that are mentioned or professions, for example. Secondly, we can also do a scanning relay. So you stick the reading text outside of the classroom, get students into groups, and one runs out to scan the text for the first answer to the question which the group have. They come back and they tell the group, and then the next person goes, and so on until they've completed all of their answers. This works well as it is competitive and timed, therefore meaning that students will use their scanning skills to find the answer rather than spending time reading the whole text. And finally, we've got quick fire questions. So prepare 4 or 5 questions about the text before the class, ask the questions, and in teams get them to shout out the answer once they've found it. And again, this is good for practicing quick reading, scanning skills, and also adding some competition into the classroom as well. So all of these activities are good for providing motivation because it keeps the students on their toes. It doesn't always practice the task types in the same repetitive way as well. So finally, when we practice writing, we often go through the structure, the language, and then give students the opportunity to write a whole piece. But a way to practice writing is to divide the class into groups of 4 to give them each a different essay topic. Student A works on paraphrasing the question for the introduction. Student B works on the main body and the arguments in the second paragraph. Student C the third, and student D on the conclusion. So you can set a time and get students to pass their paragraph to the next person in the group. That student then has to continue the piece by writing the next paragraph. So not only does this allow for students to practice working on different topics, but it also avoids having to write a whole essay each time and encourages students to share their ideas by using different vocabulary, a range of vocabulary on different topics. I've tried this myself and they really enjoyed it because they aren't just focused on one thing. And although they are writing a whole essay, it's a bit more broken up so they don't seem as stressed out or sort of deliberating over it and worrying about timings too much. So if anyone has any other interactive exam activities or has any other ways of adding interactivity to common task types, feel free to write them in the chat box below if you'd like to share any of your ideas as well. So Agnes, your question, how much time would you give students for each paragraph? So in the C1, so the advanced exam, the writing is 1 hour and 30 minutes. So we've got 45 minutes for the first task and 45 for the second task. So I'd probably divide up the 45 minutes into 4. So each student has the same amount of time to write each paragraph as well, if that makes sense. Okay, so moving on to our second point, so peer teaching strategies. So I think firstly it's important to consider the layout of the classroom, which needs to be conducive to an interactive environment. So something which I agree with is the arrangement of the desks can create or contribute to the manner and the positivity inside the classroom. So just by looking at these 4 pictures, of course we've all got different size and classroom restraints, but from these 4 pictures, which of these do you think would be the best classroom layout or the best setup of a classroom? So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you could just write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so I think, yeah, it does definitely depend on the activity, the ages, also the size of the classroom that we have. Olaf, you're right, depends on the activity as well. A lot of people saying 2. And yeah, Alejandro, I agree with you. It does definitely depend. So let's just have a look at them. So I think in picture 1, there can quite often not be student interaction, but it may be good for practice tests, for example, because they do have to work alone. In classroom layout 2, there can be more opportunities for interaction, but of course, if we have space limitations, this might not be ideal. And again, monitoring might be quite different in this situation because students might get distracted by listening to what you're saying to another student, although it's quite good for debates, whole class discussions, but maybe not necessarily for an exam class all the time. But again, we can move our chairs and tables around as much as we need to. In picture 3, by grouping the desks, we can, of course, encourage collaboration. But as we're creatures of habit, people might tend to sit in the same place, thus working with the same students. And some students might have their back to you as well, just depending on which way the desks are facing. So I'd say in order to have sort of an open and sharing classroom, picture 4 might be a good option, which allows for pair work, ease of moving around if necessary, allows visibility of the teacher and the board as well. Again, it works for practice test 2, where students are sitting individually, but of course it all depends on classroom limitations, but generally a semicircle or an environment like this generally fosters a more peer interaction. So a question for you. So pair work and group work is important, but why do we think pair or group work is important in exam classes in particular? So I'll just give you a minute to write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so Olga for speaking. So Ramona, the question was, why do you think pair and group work is particularly important in exam classes? So Regina, social things, yeah, oral practice, Lydia. Yeah, assessment as well, and assessment of each other too, definitely. Sharing ideas, yeah. Okay, so I think it's important to stress pair or group work, especially in an exam setting, because learners can help each other when working on tasks. And again, that encourages peer correction, but also enables students to add justification to their answers, which is something I don't think we allow enough for in classes. This builds not only their confidence, but also allows them to practice their spoken interaction. Students also have differences in mastering skills. So what one student might be good at, the other one might have a weakness in. So they can share ideas and learn from each other that way. So communicative language teaching requires a sense of community, an environment of trust with their peers and their teacher, which pair or group work can provide. So I recently did a study with 2 exam classes in my school from 11 different countries to find out how they prefer learning. So although it was carried out on just a small number of students, it did show some interesting results, which I think if I did it on a larger scale would also be representative as well. So I asked them about working alone, working with a different partner, with the same partner, small groups and large groups. And I asked them if they always prefer it, sometimes or never. So here were the results. So the results show that the majority of students like working with different partners, and a high number of students like working in small groups as well. So not many students said that they like working alone too often, and no one said that they never like working in small groups, which I think is interesting, particularly in multilingual classes, as it gives students the possibility of sharing ideas, learning from each other, and all of the things that you mentioned in the chat box as well. Which again provides motivation not only for students to learn about others and their cultures as well, but also just to share their own experiences and to personalize the lesson a little bit more. It might be interesting if you get the opportunity to ask your students their preferences on their ways of working, which can help you adapt tasks to suit their preferences as well. So moving on to adapting tasks for a student-centered environment. So it's important for students to feel like they're in control of their own language learning. So by this, it enables them to become more enthusiastic and again, more focused on the language as well. So student-centered learning shifts the focus from the teacher to the student. So it requires them to monitor their own thinking, to be conscious of their own learning while assuming responsibility for it as well. And there's many techniques we can use to encourage a student-centered environment, but it can be difficult when we're working with typical exam style classes just due to the task types we have to cover and get to know. So just before we start talking about a student-centered environment, I wondered how long your exam courses typically run for if you teach one at the moment. So if you can just write your answers in the chat box, I'll give you a minute. So how long do your exam courses run for? Two years. Agnes, that is a long course. And do you teach them for the whole 2 years or 9 months, 12 to 18 months? So quite long courses. 9 months, yeah. So I think particularly when you have long courses, it is definitely really important to sort of use as many different techniques as you can to keep the students motivated, because you do have them for a long time. The academic year. So at the moment, the course that I teach is just 12 weeks, so it's quite intensive. But I think the motivation is sort of the same because it is so intensive. There's a lot more homework, a lot of things like that. So yeah, any techniques we can use to motivate them are really, really useful. 1 year, 3 years. Okay, so yeah, for me, they're usually around 12 weeks, but lots of different answers coming through. And yeah, a year, 9 months, long courses. So we can see that often we might meet, if you do have a shorter course, we might meet a lot of different students throughout the year. So firstly, I think it's essential when we first meet a group of students that we get to know as much about them as possible, particularly about their hobbies and interests as well. Just in response to the question, we do 12 weeks and we do 15 hours a week. So yeah, they're divided into 1 hour 20 classes. So yeah, as teachers, once we get to know the backgrounds, their hobbies and interests, we can then start to group together, sort of in a figurative sense, students with similar interests. So then we can try and use this to our advantage by focusing certain task types around these interests. So for example, if we know some of our students are passionate about films, we can focus a writing, as shown here, around a topic that they're interested in. So here, for example, we've got write a review about a film that you've seen. So again, that personalizes the lesson, building motivation. And again, past experiences. So here we've got a speaking task. Think about a trip in the past that you did or didn't go on. So again, past experiences, personalization, therefore giving them more enthusiasm to talk about it. So I would use this as an advantage sort of early on in the course, though, just to encourage students to use language that they're already quite familiar with, and also to build confidence as well. So later on in a course, we will need to encourage more spontaneous language production, especially as the exam draws closer. But by harnessing their interest, they'll be a lot more enthused about a topic and again might produce better language and be more motivated in the class. So of course we can't always cater every part of the course to their interests, but as exams often use common topics such as hobbies, family, work or study, we know that students will most likely have spoken about these topics before and will feel more confident than they would with less frequently discussed topics. So a question for you. So how often do you ask the students to decide what they would like to do in a lesson? So if you could just write your answers in the chat box below. So once a week, we've got very frequently. Okay, Alicia, that's quite interesting. Rather rarely. I think sometimes it's quite difficult for us to sort of give up control, especially if we are teaching sort of lower level students, maybe at PET level. I think teachers must be willing to give up some control of the class, which means asking students for input. So for example, we can ask the students what type of task they would like to practice from the exam. So we're not giving 100% control, we're just sort of recommending them things and they get to choose one. Yeah, so as Agnes said, how they would like to do an activity or what type of activity they'd like to practice. So a couple of times if students have chosen a specific grammar point, such as the past tense to revise, I've divided students into groups and given them each a tense that they can prepare a presentation about, often ones that are commonly confused, such as past simple and present perfect simple. Then they can prepare the presentation, they can introduce the grammar point, provide an activity for the students to practice, so their peers to practice, and then that way students are learning from each other and tend to retain information a little bit easier that way too. So if you prefer not to let go of 100% control, you can always give a few options to students to choose from. And then that way they'll still feel like that they're in control of their own learning as well. So I think Lydia said that she has tried that, and yeah, it is an amazing experience. But you can also provide feedback by giving them marks on sort of the way that they're speaking, their body language, and it also relates to their exam as well, just to know how they're wording it, their hesitation, and all of the marking criteria that we looked at earlier as well. We can give them feedback on that too. So typically exam tasks are quite individual. So although we still need to prepare students for their exams, we also need to ensure that they're learning useful English as well. Again, I think that builds motivation. So if students can't relate what is happening inside the classroom to a real world environment, their motivation will lack and subsequently attendance may drop, or they might lose focus and start distracting others as well. So make sure that we just let them know when we teach a grammar point how we can incorporate that into real life as well. So often when teaching an exam class, we find ourselves with mixed level or mixed ability classes. So can you just type yes in the chat box if this has happened to you before? So if you've had a mixed level or mixed ability class. So I'll be surprised if I see a no, actually. So as we know, this can lead to more advanced students feeling demotivated if they find themselves sat there doing nothing once finishing a task faster than the other students, or if they find a task not challenging enough either. So yeah, I think the same goes for fast finishers because everyone works at their own pace as well. So what can we do in order to keep the higher level students or fast finishers motivated? So if you have any ideas, can you write them in the chat box below? So ways to keep them motivated if they feel they need a bit more of a challenge or if they work quicker than the other students. So extra tasks, where would we get these extra tasks from, for example? Lydia, that's a nice point, tutoring the others as well. Yeah, help their friends, definitely. Yeah, helping slower students and again going around checking answers as well. That's a good idea for Olaf. Yeah, prepare more challenging tasks, Irina, as well. So I think an example that we've got here. So we've got a photocopy of an activity which actually was prepared for speaking but actually it can be adapted to get students to prepare or make notes on their answers, or even turn it into a short writing activity. We also have the example here of a gap fill, so a grammar gap fill, infinitive or gerund. So depending on which exam material or course books you use, there's often photocopyable materials in the teacher's resource books, which are specifically aimed at fast finishers. Here we have another example of a suffix activity and a useful photocopyable here, which also gives students practice of a task type, so part 1 of the use of English paper as well. So I think as teachers, we must sort of realise that if we do have a mixed level class, which is the majority of the time, it will inevitably require more preparation time. So I'd say that pairing lower students with high level students would be very effective, as some of you mentioned in the chat box. Also getting them to mark each other's work, to help each other, but not specifically giving them the answers. And also, peer observation, peer correction, and of course the photocopyable extension activities as well, which saves a little bit on our preparation time too. I think if we don't have extension activities prepared, it can cause quite a lot of demotivation. And I don't know if any of you have problems with mobile phones or anything like that, but quite often when students finish the task, the first thing they'll do is pick up their phones or pick up something to distract themselves. And again, there's no time to sort of process the information that they've just learned or studied. So I think we definitely need to have something prepared for that. I can see Diana agrees with the phones and the distractions there. Of course, this becomes a bit easier as we get to know our students in class a little bit more over time. But in the first few weeks, it's really important to just look out for those students that we think might need the extra material. So some other extension opportunities for fast finishers are to work out the definitions of new vocabulary, write them on the board for the class. Another option could be to write a response, a personal response to a reading text, a listening or a spoken discussion. We can encourage peer marking, as you mentioned before, writing questions using the vocabulary or grammar learned in the lesson to then do a mingle activity at the end to encourage speaking as well. Ask the student to look at the listening tape script for vocabulary and grammar as well, and photocopyable activities as we've touched on as well. As Lydia mentioned, mobile phones can be very useful in the classroom depending on what you're doing. But I'd just say sort of at the end of an activity, unless they're doing specific research or anything, generally they're probably using it to sort of distract themselves. So moving on to encouraging learner autonomy. So we just spoke a moment ago about student-centered learning environments. But in relation to this, we also need to encourage learner autonomy as well. So learner autonomy, which was first coined in 1981, allows for students to reflect on their experiences to create their own meanings and to challenge ideas and theories. So there's lots of different ways to encourage this, such as enabling student choice, as we've talked about, and students sort of choosing what they want to learn or the task they can do in or out of class as well. So one way to encourage learner autonomy is by using open-ended question techniques. So it allows students to think more critically and to enhance their problem-solving skills as well. So if it's done as a whole class, it allows opportunity for peer learning, open class discussions, and also sort of delayed error correction for you as well. Homework. So homework is something that, although it can be quite time consuming for the teacher in the long term, just in terms of marking, which is time we might not necessarily have, I don't think it should be forgotten just in terms of a follow-up or a feedback. So if it's a written task with a worksheet or something like that, we could always give it back to the student to correct their answers once we've marked it, and then give it back to you to check again, just to avoid fossilization of errors, but also to confirm to the student that the teacher is genuinely taking the time to consider their progress and noticing developments and changes as well. Students can also peer mark, so correcting each other's errors. So that's encouraging them to think for themselves, sort of not be too dependent on the teacher. And if you think the students are capable of sort of marking their own work as well, then definitely try that. It takes away from teacher dependence, but it also takes it away from just focusing mainly on the answers. It allows for the thought process of why have I come to that answer? Why did I write it in that particular way? And allows for justification or even a discussion among students as well. So we can also ask students to set their own achievable goals. So they might need a little bit of prompting with this, but it can be something small, such as including a certain phrase in their speaking or writing, or something bigger, such as giving a presentation in front of the class. Finally, I've often done the activity where students teach each other, as we spoke about earlier, and in that way it's encouraging autonomy and encouraging them just to learn from each other and to retain the information a bit better as well. So all of these things encourage the students to try and learn for themselves. And as Evelyn said as well, make lessons goal oriented. Definitely have an aim at the beginning. And then at the end, you can ask them explicitly, do you think we've achieved these aims? If not, we can continue and develop them into the next class as well. So I think we need to set out clear goals and clear strategies when we're teaching an exam course, particularly if you are teaching the long ones. So just before we move on to progress, if you could write in the chat box, how do you personally monitor students' progress through an exam course? So I'll just give you a minute to write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so mock exams, of course. Yeah, so lots of mock exams, work records posted up, quizzes, yeah, past papers, definitely. So I think progress checks are essential to sort of maintaining the student motivation, especially if the student is quite reliant on your feedback in order to understand their own progress or if they'll be able to pass the exam. So as teachers, we don't often have much extra time to do these things, but even if it is a 3-minute discussion with the students while other students are completing a task, a Kahoot, as someone just mentioned as well, just a revision quiz just to make it a bit more fun and dynamic. The student will feel generally cared about and will then know sort of which areas they need to focus on. I think, again, if we meet with the student one-to-one, just for a 2-3 minute chat, it also encourages students to maybe notice their own errors and to know what they need to study. Again, providing opportunities for learner autonomy as well. So just out of curiosity, I wondered if you can write in the chat box whether the institution or the school that you work in allows you to have time or sets aside time for progress checks with students. If they do, when do they allow for this and how long do they give you and things like that. Yeah, so most people are saying no, within class time only. Yeah, so I think, okay, class time only once or twice a year. So I think most of us don't really have much time. So it is either up to us to take time to do that or try and figure out a strategy to give them feedback. So I think giving feedback, but as well as that, praise and recognition throughout the course. So we often tell students of errors and point out mistakes, but actually just to let the students know the things that they're doing particularly well and the areas that they're quite strong in, particularly again towards the last few weeks of the course, so maybe their motivation's wavering and tensions can be quite high. This will boost their confidence and by feeling good that you've noticed their achievements and their personal improvements, and again therefore maintaining that motivation as well. And so something that Rimvalucri said is that teachers' judgment towards students in the classroom can bring the problem of anxiety and stress, which might therefore lose focus and motivation. So something that us as teachers may not realise, but body language, eye contact, or even the way that something's said, the way we error correct, for example, can make positive reinforcement maybe seem insincere, or the students might misconstrue it, meaning there might be a sort of a lack of trust in the teacher and the student relationship. So I think during the lead up to the exam, it's quite crucial that we keep an eye on all of our students just to notice any lack of enthusiasms, to deal with those issues again if we can just take 2 minutes while the others are working on a task or doing a speaking task, just by trying as many new and dynamic teaching techniques as we've all discussed. So for example, if the students are recording themselves, as we mentioned earlier in the speaking activity, you can use that time to have a one-on-one with the students that are just preparing for their speaking task. So it's just about finding that balance in that time. So in order to keep our students motivated, we also need to motivate ourselves and keep our energy levels up, particularly for those of you who have really long exam classes. So how can we maintain our own energy levels? So if you could just write your answers in the chat box below. So sport, hobbies and interests. Yeah, Lydia, is a difficult question. I'm surprised no one's written coffee yet. Yeah, so everyone has their own sort of different ways. Lots of chocolate, Diana, I agree. That's my way of doing it as well. So yeah, I think it's really important that although we might be following a course book, for example, one way that we can motivate ourselves is to plan supplementary activities and maybe even create our own activities, because then once we've presented those to the students, we feel sort of a sense of achievement in ourselves that they've really enjoyed the activities that we've planned ourselves. So you feel like you're achieving. I also think constantly changing up sort of what you're doing in the classroom. So not simply repeating writing after writing, but maybe trying the circuits that we discussed earlier. But also I'd say sort of speaking to other colleagues as well, combining and collaborating with them where possible too. So another exam class in the school, for example, you can meet up with them, practice speaking tasks, or simply just to collaborate, share ideas, have a quiz, and some of the role plays and debates that you mentioned earlier as well. So hopefully by using some of the ideas mentioned today, we can ensure students remain enthusiastic about their learning and also achieve success in their exams. So does anyone have any questions or anything to add at all? So if you do, just please feel free to write them in the chat box. So just to let you know, we do have 2 more webinars coming up in the series. So we've got Step 6, which is from John Wolfe, who is also a teacher, who will be giving some strategies on teaching exams with enjoyment on the 26th. So that's on Tuesday next week. And also we've got Mindfulness of Pre-Exam Stress from Amy as well. And then there'll be 2 further Pearson webinars on the Pearson course, which will be coming soon as well. So as I said, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to write them in the chat box. We've also got a link here so you can have a look at any of the upcoming webinars. And as I said, the recordings will be sent out to you. The handout will be sent out to you in a couple of days, and the recordings will be available online too. So we've got from Brian, how can we motivate students who refuse to speak in English? So that's a very good question. Of course, if you're teaching a monolingual class, especially if you're teaching English in a country where everyone speaks the same language and you speak the same language and the students are aware of that as well. I think the difficult thing is giving them a purpose, you know, sort of relating it to the real life as well. Knowing when we learn this grammar point, how can we use that in the real world? How can it fit into my life, you know? Sort of setting achievable goals, as we mentioned as well. Just sort of giving them, okay, we've got 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, we're going to, if you can take them out on a trip to try and learn that, to practice their English, even sort of watching a series that you've been building up to with some comprehension questions as well, and using authentic materials in the classroom as well. I've had students in my class previously who have just purely learned English from watching series, which is incredible. So I think that if they can use that English and relate it to something that they're interested in, that will really help them as well. Question from Simon, when pairing weaker students with stronger, how can we stop weaker students feeling even worse that they can't do it as fast? So as I mentioned earlier, I think everyone's got their strengths and weaknesses. So what might appear to be a weaker student, maybe when they're oral English, they might really sort of thrive in grammatical questions or grammatical things. So I know that's the case in my class because I teach a multilingual class. So I would say that, of course, don't pair up the strongest with the weakest person, but just sort of be aware of the students and get them to share each other's ideas, get them to meet sort of in the class, write a little note on a piece of paper, a strength or a positive comment about somebody else, pick them out anonymously, and then that will get them sort of building their confidence and feeling better about themselves too. And as Lydia said, yeah, you definitely need to choose the right students to pair up as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for your kind comments and for attending the webinar today. So yeah, I hope you get to use some of the techniques in your class, and I hope they work successfully. So yeah, thank you very much, and have a great day or a great evening wherever in the world you are as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.